Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Daniel Mattingly. He is an assistant professor of political science at Yale who studies the political economy of development and authoritarian politics with a focus on China. His current work examines the role of the military, nationalism, and surveillance technology in Chinese politics. Today we'll talk with Professor Mattingly about his new book, The Art of Political Control in China. Welcome, Professor Mattingly.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Absolutely. So my book looks at the sort of hidden side of political control in China. So what motivates the book is an interest in understanding China and China's rise, which I think is one of the most interesting, exciting stories of the 21st century. So you have in China a country where over 800 million people have lifted themselves out of dollar-a-day poverty into the global middle class. And at the same time, you have a state that's implemented these ambitious, far-reaching policies of social control and social engineering. So I think an example that most people in the United States would be familiar with is the OneChild Policy, which limited the number of children that people could have. But there have been also a number of other policies, especially policies around property rights and lands that have also sort of reached deeply into society and changed it. So the question that I'm interested in with the book is, how has the state implemented these ambitious, far-reaching policies of social engineering while at the same time controlling protest? And the basic answer that I have in the book is that it's not just about the police. So I think in the West, often when we think about authoritarian regimes, we have this image of authoritarian regimes controlling society through the police and through coercion. And that certainly happens in China. So I think an important example in China is what's happening in the western part of China, in the province of Xinjiang, which is a region of China that's inhabited by Uyghurs, a Muslim ethnic minority, and over 1 million people have been sent to re-education camps in Xinjiang, an extremely kind of coercive policy. So there's been some good reporting on this in the New York Times and other outlets. So my research, so that certainly happens in authoritarian regimes, including China. My research, though, focuses on this more sort of hidden tools that the state uses, even in places like Xinjiang, but certainly throughout China, to control society. So the surprising thing that I find in my book is that civil society groups, local grassroots social organizations are sort of great tools for the state to influence, control, and monitor society. So grassroots social organizations that in other contexts we might think are useful for organizing and holding leaders accountable are, in an authoritarian context like China, actually quite useful for the state to implement policies like the One-Child Policy or land requisitions while maintaining political stability.
Okay, and so we will unpack all of that in a minute, but I am curious to know what led you to be interested in this.
Absolutely. So I was a Yale undergrad back in the day, and after I graduated from Yale, I went and lived in China. So if there are Yale undergrads watching, I guess, there are some great programs at Yale to go study and live in China after you graduate. So I took advantage of some of these programs while I was an undergrad at Yale, lived in China, and I think when I was in China, starting in the mid-2000s.
Where were you?
I was in Hunan province, which is sort of in the southeastern, southwestern part of China. So it's kind of sort of, if you overlaid China on the United States, it's sort of where Arkansas is.
Oh, okay.
So
and why did you go there?
So I did a program actually through Princeton called Princeton in Asia that sent me to Hunan province. Yale, the Yale China Association also has a great program that sends teachers to the same province to teach. So I just happened to be sent to that province, which is a great sort of fascinating introduction to China. This is a part of China that was developing really rapidly when I went there. So I mean, I think some of my good friends who's even a generation ago, their parents weren't able to have meat every week because, not just because of the Great Leap Forward, but because it was a relatively poor area of China. By the time I was there in the mid-2000s, not only were they putting bacon on the table every day, but people were starting to buy cars, had nice apartments, and were sort of starting to enter the middle class. So seeing this was sort of fascinating. But on the other hand, just down the road, there were people who, as part of these local state-led development projects, people who were being forced from their land and weren't very happy about it. So China, I think like the United States, is a big country full of contradictions, and so sort of seeing on the one hand this rapid development, which is really what's behind the rise of China on the world stage, and on the other hand, people who were, in this case, trying to fight for their land, fight for their property, and was something that fascinated me. And so that sort of led directly into this book project and understanding the roots of political control.
And how did you do the research for the book?
So for the book, I went and did field research in a number of villages in China. So this involved partly going and living there again. While
Still in the Hunan area or a different part of China?
So I did go to Hunan province as for part of my research, and also I spent some time in Guangdong province, Jiangsu, and Hunan. So I went to 4 different provinces, but most of my research was focused in the southern province of Guangdong, which is next to Hong Kong, and actually next to Hunan. But I did go back to Hunan to do research. So I took a multi-method approach. So I did a couple of things. First, I went to and stayed for a while and interviewed people in some of these villages to try to understand how the process of local development and land requisition happened. I was especially interested in land rights and how farmers and the rural poor can ensure that they have access to land that's theirs, and if the state decides to requisition and redevelop it, that they can get good compensation. And just to try to understand the politics of these villages and what caused people to mobilize or not mobilize in protests. So I combined the sort of boots on the ground, I guess, almost ethnographic approach with collecting data. So I also did survey research across a number of villages in China. And so kind of using this quantitative data and the qualitative data, I was able to triangulate on an answer for how it is that the state has been able to requisition land and implement the one-child policy without encountering widespread protest in all cases.
Okay, so what did you determine? How are they able to do that? I'm particularly interested in the one-child rule. And is that still in existence today? I thought I had read that it's not, but it is?
No, so the China's family planning policies have been modified.
Okay, that's what I thought I heard, yeah.
So, it was never, it's called the one-child policy in the West, but it was, first of all, in China, it was never a blanket one-child policy. So there have often been exceptions. Policies are different in different provinces and even to a certain extent in different counties. And there are exceptions carved out for people who are ethnic minorities or people who, in some cases, if you have a daughter as your first child, you might be able to have a second child, especially if you live in a rural part of China. So the one-child policy, I think is in many ways maybe an emblem in the West of social engineering and social control in an authoritarian regime like China. And I think it's an interesting policy because I think in a lot of urban China, it has a lot of political legitimacy. I think a lot of people would probably have willingly only had one child anyway. And people, I think, so people in some sense saw the need for it. It's a much less popular policy in rural China, partly for economic reasons. It's just more useful to have more children if you're farming or if you need to send children to cities to work and then remit your wages back home. So it's a much less popular in policy in rural China, which is what I was focusing on. So the kind of puzzle there is why do people in rural China comply with this anyway? And so one answer to this is coercion, but another piece to this, which is the piece that I explore, which I think social scientists have thought about less, is the non-coercive side of it, which is the way that the state uses social organizations to try to influence and control.
Okay, and let's talk about that. How do they use those things? What are some of the strategies that they employ to kind of covertly control the people?
So I talk about 3 different strategies in my book. The first is using local social organizations, especially local civil society organizations, as a direct tool of social control.
And
so in rural, go ahead.
Tell us what a civil group is, civil society group.
The sorts of civil society groups that I look at in my project are mostly rural social organizations. So you could think of temple associations, folk religious organizations that might that have local temple groups, lineage associations. These are kinship networks that might create a local association and have an ancestral hall with ancestral tablets to venerate and celebrate their ancestors. Also, more sort of traditional folk music groups are another kind of social organization.
All right, so
that I
it
looked
sounds
at.
like a very diverse group. So how do they tap those organizations to kind of manipulate what they want to happen?
So there are a few different ways, and it's not completely, I don't want to paint the picture that it's
Okay.
completely insidious,
Okay,
that
yes.
it's a completely insidious
Process.
A lot of times where these are organizations that people, of course, are genuinely interested in
Sure.
and interested in starting. So China in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when Mao Zedong was in power, abolished a lot of these groups and tried to get rid of them. They sort of reconstituted or were revived starting in the 1980s. And even though China as a communist country is sort of nominally, or at least tries to discourage religion and some of these local civic organizations. However, as I think in the 80s when these groups, and 90s when these groups were getting started again, local officials often saw them as useful for them because the existence of this local group meant two things. One, if you have members of these groups, it's a little bit easier to monitor them and see what's going on. So if you have people regularly coming and going to one of these temples or ancestral halls, it just makes them a little bit easier to monitor. I think it's also especially useful because these groups often have leaders who then have social influence. And this informal social influence is really useful for officials when they want to implement policy. So if you want to convince somebody that they should comply with the one-child policy, or if you want to convince somebody that they should move off their land so the village can build a new factory, it's useful to have these socially influential allies who can help persuade you to move people off their land. So I think it's more a process of sort of allowing these groups to flourish because they're useful for local
But
elites.
describe how the groups are actually. I'm curious to know, like, does the government contact one person in the group and says, hey, you know, we kind of want this or that to happen? I mean, how does the process actually work? I'm curious, the very nitty-gritty of that.
The nitty-gritty of it. So it's often a kind of organic process that happens over time. So you might have in a village the leader, for example, of a local lineage group. Again, these are kind of extended kinship networks, so you can think of as essentially clans. And the leader of this kinship group might have been someone who sort of emerged over time as just somebody who was unusually competent and authoritative, someone to whom others in the group would go to sort of ask for advice, to try to get a job, to sort of ask what's the right social etiquette for putting on a wedding, you know, how many pounds of rice do I need to bring to the bride? And so in a lot of villages, you have somebody who is maybe the kind of informal or de facto leader of this kinship network. Once that person emerges, it can be a kind of natural process then for local political leaders, like the Communist Party secretary of the village, who's sort of the most powerful political figure in a village in China, for this person to seek out this socially influential person and say, well, listen, we need to take land from the following 5 farmers who are in your clan, or because we need to build a road, or because we need to put in a power transformer or
it's
something.
Like eminent domain in this country.
Exactly, it's like eminent
similar.
domain, but you have to get people to actually comply with it. And especially if you're not offering compensation at the market rate, which is generally what happens, or what happens in a lot of these cases, especially in rural China. So it's useful to have these local elites as allies for the state to help implement these policies. And a more kind of direct, go ahead.
And then would it be an honor for the people who comply with the request? I mean, culturally, how would they be looked upon by the rest of the group?
Well, I think that in general, the reason it's useful to have these allies is because they do have social authority. So I'm not sure it's an honor, but I think that there is a kind of social obligation that comes with being a member of these social groups. That means that you need to listen to the people who have power. And I think this, of course, this isn't something that's specific or strange or unique to China, or to how lineage groups or temple groups or neighborhood associations are organized in China. I mean, you could think of politically or socially influential people in your own neighborhood who might be, they could be priests or rabbis, or just somebody who has become a kind of neighborhood leader because they're charismatic and energetic. And there's a certain amount of social pressure, I think, to listen to people in these positions of social authority. So I'm sort of looking at what's often the kind of the flip side of these social groups. I think In academia, we often think about civil society as beneficial to democracy, and I think that that can be the case.
Sure.
That these organizations can be used, to mobilize people, to hold political leaders accountable when they don't behave well. The flip side to that, though, is that these social groups can also be useful for political leaders when they want to get something done that doesn't always benefit local society.
So what happens when local society doesn't want to do what someone has suggested that they do, one of these political leaders or the leader of the civil society?
So the flip side to this is that that I argue that places that don't have strong civil society groups or don't have strong what I call infiltrating organizations, which are more direct organizations actually set up by the Communist Party, so party cells, small groups, which are sort of the equivalent of like a neighborhood watch group, which is directly controlled and set up by the party. And these are also very useful direct mechanisms of control through grassroots organizations. The flip side to this is when these organizations don't exist, it's actually almost paradoxically easier for social groups to organize. So in the sort of absence of civil society, it's easier to get leaderless protest.
Okay.
So this is something that I saw in a number of villages. So people who were, for example, unhappy with their land being requisitioned by the state. They weren't getting very good compensation. They didn't feel like, in the long run, this is a good deal for them. They wanted to hold on to the land that had been, in their family for, in some cases, over a dozen generations. So what did they do? They didn't have a local sort of civil society lineage association that would help them organize. So instead, they turned to sort of leaderless, quasi-leaderless methods of political organizations. So,
Such as what?
So in the case of one village, a small group of villagers basically anonymously hung up posters all over the village saying, okay, we're all unhappy. They sort of took the temperature of everybody, knew that everybody was unhappy, and hung posters up around the village telling people, okay, we're going to meet here at the village square at a certain time on a certain day to put pressure on local leaders and protest against this land requisition.
And how does that work? I mean, what was the outcome?
So the outcome was they got to keep their land because
okay.
basically enough of the people in the village mobilized. I think something like 80% of the village actually ended up coming out to the square, even though there wasn't a kind of clear leader of this protest. It was just some anonymous citizen or group of citizens who was putting these posters up around the village. Enough people came out that higher levels of local government took notice and saw what was going on in this village and ended up halting the land requisition. So people were able to get what they want by mobilizing, but it was helpful to use this tactic of leaderless protest.
Okay, so I guess my next question would be, were those people fearful that there would be any retribution by the government for coming out and basically saying that they were against what was happening?
Well, I think there's power in numbers, right? I think that they would have legitimately been fearful if there were a small number of people who were the clear leaders of this protest. And often that does happen, where they're leaders of the protest. It's possible to identify who they are, and then they face pressure. The pressure could either be pressure from their family members who might have jobs, government jobs, and are threatened to lose. They're threatened to lose their jobs if they don't pressure their own family to stand down, or of course they might be jailed or beaten by the police if they're clear leaders of the protest.
Right,
If it's leaderless, there are no leaders to target and put in jail. And if you have 80% of a town coming out to protest, is the government going to jail 80% of the people in the town? Clearly not.
Right.
So it forces, to a certain extent, it can force local governments to make concessions if you mobilize enough people.
Okay, so let's talk about what's going on in Hong Kong for the past 6 months. What's your take on that situation?
So the dynamics in Hong Kong are, I think there's some interesting similarities to what happens in mainland China. Of course, there are important differences. But the important differences, really briefly, Hong Kong has been a sort of, it's been a special administrative region of China since 1997 after the handover from the British. And so Hong Kong has been guaranteed certain protections under the one country, two systems policy, especially greater civil liberties than exist in the mainland. So I think the protest was originally motivated by a desire to try to hold on to these civil liberties. So the Hong Kong government had proposed an extradition law that people were worried would allow the government in the mainland to then extradite people who spoke out against it. So that was sort of what drove these protests. One of the interesting things is the tactics used by the protesters and the tactics used by the government are quite similar to what happens in the mainland. So on the protester side, one of the reasons why these protests have succeeded is precisely they've adopted this leaderless protest model that I described to you as happens in the mainland. In Hong Kong, it's a much more high-tech model than going and sort of putting up posters around a village. They're using encrypted social media apps like Telegram to organize and decide where to protest, decide what tactics to use. Protesters are also using online forums to do this. And it's partly a reaction against what happened to an earlier wave of protests in 2014 when there were clear leaders of this protest, and then the state targeted them, as often happens in the mainland. So how's the government responded? Well, so one of the tactics, I mean, obviously, the most important thing the government has done is respond is to use outright coercion, a ton of tear gas, rubber bullets, and arrests. At the same time, the government has also tried to use social organizations as a way to mobilize pro-government, pro-mainland support in a way that I think echoes what happens with these civil society groups in the mainland. So in Hong Kong, these groups are, one type of group that has done this are native place associations. So these are people who have moved to Hong Kong, or their ancestors maybe a generation or two before have moved to Hong Kong from a place in mainland China, like Fujian. And then they set up associations, just clubs, right, for people to organize. And the government, to some extent, has used these associations to mobilize people against the pro-democracy protesters and in support of the mainland government. So this is a kind of inversion of what we usually think of as you have a robust civil society. The civil society is going to strengthen democracy. In this case, at least one element of Hong Kong civil society is being used to organize in support of the government and against these pro-democracy protesters.
Okay, so what do you think the future holds for the protesters? What do you think will end up happening?
That's a good question. I mean,
there's no way to know for
there's
sure.
No way to know,
I'm
right?
just wondering if you have any ideas.
Well, I think that the protests in some ways have been tactically innovative. So there's been on the negative side, there's been violence, and I think violence against people, which you can't really excuse. Violence targeting people from the mainland. I think there's also been a lot of property damage, which I think is ethically different. I mean, I think still maybe not something that certainly in the West, in the tradition of nonviolent protests, that people would advocate for, but I think is at least distinct from violence against people. But I think the great mass of protesters aren't violent towards people and aren't extremists, and their desire is basically to protect the civil liberties that they have. So they've adopted these innovative tactics of sort of leaderless protests using these apps and some more sorts of innovative cooperative tactics on the ground. The kind of motto, one of the mottos of the protests is "be like water." So the idea is that the protesters kind of shift around so that the police can't surround them and kettle them and arrest them. I think, though, that these sorts of tactical innovations, which have worked to sustain this protest for a long time. So the protests have been going on for months now. I mean, it outlasted the 2014 umbrella movement. It's outlasted the revolution in Egypt. Has outlasted the 1989 movement in mainland China. But strategically, it's not clear to me where these protests are going and whether or not I think that the protesters have succeeded in pushing back and wringing concessions from the government. The government withdrew the extradition law that I talked about earlier, which was the original impetus for the protesters.
So if they withdrew that, why are they still protesting?
So the protesters actually have five demands. And so the government has essentially met one of them, but they did it they did it in sort of slow motion in a way that I think didn't really satisfy very many people. And so some of the other demands, like a demand for an inquiry into police violence, which I think is a demand that Beijing could potentially meet if they wanted to. The resignation of the chief executive, which again is something that could potentially happen. Amnesty for all of the protesters who've been arrested, which I think is probably politically more difficult for Beijing. So I think that the fact that the government hasn't met these other demands, and especially the fact that the amount of tear gas used, the amount of rubber bullets used, and the number of arrests has mobilized I think surprisingly, the rest of Hong Kong to support these young protesters. So the frontline protesters are a lot of young people who are kind of college age or sometimes even younger, maybe into their mid-20s. The surprising thing is that this protest, despite the violence, maintains high levels of support among the Hong Kong middle class. We see this in surveys, we see this in the results of elections that were held recently, which the pro-democracy camp won pretty resoundingly, and a big reversal for Beijing.
Right.
So the fact that they continue to have this support in the, among a relatively broad swath of the Hong Kong population means that I think we'll probably continue to see some level of mobilization.
Right.
I think if the government was continue to make concessions, you might see a slow fading away of the protests.
Interesting. So what would you like your readers to take away from your book?
So I think two main things to take away from the book. I think the first is that when we think about how governments control societies, we often think just about outright violence and coercion, or sometimes we think also about the ways in which governments generate legitimacy. So in the United States and democracies, there's a lot of theory around how the democratic process generates legitimacy so that people think that the government's laws and policies are just and then comply with them. I think that there's a whole range of tactics that governments use in between this that are neither quite about legitimacy nor are they violent coercion, that are more sort of hidden forms of coercion that get people to comply with the state. So that's the sort of main kind of theoretical takeaway. I mean, I think also in the bigger picture, I think the book, one of the things that I hope people take away from the book is that I think it's also a hopeful book in a lot of ways. And I think it hopefully tells the story of a lot of people who are able to get what they want from their governments, in part by organizing under quite difficult circumstances. So in the long run, so I'm a China optimist, especially in the long run, and I hope that some of the optimism comes out in the book.
Okay, well, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much for being here and sharing some of your work.
Great, thank you for having me.
For more information about Professor Mattingly and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.